היי, נעים מאוד, קוראים לי שחר הרמלין, אני הדובר של המועצה לשימור אתרי מורשת בישראל. שמח מאוד לראות גם פנים מוכרות מלפני הרבה שנים, גם פנים חדשות. לאט לאט אני מקווה לעבור ולהכיר גם את האתרים ואת המנהלות והמנהלים שעוד לא יצא לי באופן אישי. אנחנו בסשן מאוד מיוחד, יש לנו הזדמנות לראות איך נעשים דברים בתחום אתרי המורשת במקום אחר, ולא סתם מקום, אלא מעצמת מורשת כמו אנגליה. ועוד רגע תצטרף אלינו יושבת ראש של ארגון English Heritage, שזה פחות או יותר, אם אני עושה איזושהי אנלוגיה מאוד מאוד רחבה, המקבילה של המועצה לשימור אתרים באנגליה, אבל זה גוף הרבה יותר רחב, עם מעמד אחר, אבל לא ניכנס להבדלים האלה. בכל מקרה, היא הסכימה להצטרף אלינו ולספר על נושא שימור מורשת ואתרי מורשת באנגליה. איך הם עושים את זה? זו עמותה אחת הגדולות שקיימות בעולם בתחום הזה. ובזמן שהיא תדבר, מי שקצת מתקשה עם השפה האנגלית, יהיה לנו תרגום סימולטני לעברית בתחתית המסך. היא תדבר כ-20 דקות, ויהיו לנו אחר כך עוד מספר דקות לשאלות ותשובות, ואם אתם רוצים לשאול משהו, אז בבקשה לעשות את זה בצורה מאוד תמציתית. אני אחבר בין השאלה שלכם אליה, ואם נצטרך לתרגם בתמצית את התשובות שלה, אז גם את זה אני אשתדל לעזור. ואם כולנו מוכנים, אז אני אפנה אליה. Kate, are you with us?
I'm here, yes. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone.
Yes, so still good morning in the UK, good afternoon already in Israel. So here in the auditorium with me, we have many managers of heritage sites in Israel all over the country, and they are very excited with the opportunity to hear how things are done in England. So as the CEO of English Heritage, the floor is yours to tell us how you guys are doing this.
Well, thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen, if I might. It's disappeared again. So give me a second. Is it this one? And then that's forward. Right, thank you. Right, thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you today. It's always a real pleasure to speak with fellow heritage practitioners from around the world and to share my experiences and to listen to yours. For those of you unfamiliar with English Heritage, it's a charity that cares for the National Heritage Collection of over 400 historic sites in England. As part of this talk, I'll provide some context as to how both the collection of sites we care for and the charity itself came into being, and how English Heritage is bringing those sites to life, and how, especially after the pandemic, we're looking to the future. But to begin at the beginning, Kit's Coty House is a Neolithic long barrow in Kent, southeast England, built between 4000 and 3000 BC, a burial place for the earliest farming communities in Britain. In 1883, several millennia after those stones were first erected, its owner took advantage of new legislation and offered the prehistoric monument to the state so that it would care for the long barrow and protect it. The offer was accepted, and Kit's Coty House became practically the first of this country's historic sites to join what we now call the National Heritage Collection. An iron fence was erected around the monument to protect it from vandals, and that Victorian railing remains there today and has become a historic structure in its own right. From this small beginning, the National Heritage Collection grew and grew, and in 1918, the collection welcomed Britain's most iconic historic site, Stonehenge. And really not a moment too soon. The monument had been a popular attraction since the Middle Ages, and by the 19th century, people were regularly chipping the stones for souvenirs and scratching their names on the monument, including, as it happens, one Christopher Wren, who is the architect of St. Paul's Cathedral in London. In 1893, it was reported that most of the stones at Stonehenge were in a state of collapse. How the stone circle came into the nation's hands is a story in itself. The monument had been owned by an aristocratic family since the early 1800s, but after the eldest son was killed during the First World War, the family's whole estate, including Stonehenge, was divided up into lots and put up for auction. Enter one Cecil Chubb. Legend has it that when this barrister visited the auction room in 1915, he was there to buy, on the express instruction of his wife, a set of dining chairs. Instead, Chubb found himself bidding for lot number 15, Stonehenge with about 30 acres. When he stepped out of the auction room, he was the proud owner of one of the wonders of the world for a sum of £6,600. His wife's reaction is not recorded. 3 years later, the couple donated Stonehenge to the nation, and the Ministry of Works, which was English Heritage's predecessor, began a major programme of conservation, effectively saving the monument for future generations. And we at English Heritage continue to care for Stonehenge today. We recently repaired cracks in one of the lintels and replaced with lime mortar the cement used during conservation works in the 1950s. We also invited this little boy, Richard Woodman Bailey, to return to the stones. As an 8-year-old, during those earlier conservation works, Richard placed a 1958 half-penny beneath one of the enormous sarcens. And on his return visit, decades later, he placed a 2021 coin beneath the lintel. This is how we get good press coverage at English Heritage, by introducing human stories. With Kit's Coty House in 1883 and Stonehenge in 1918, today there are more than 400 ancient monuments and historic sites in our National Heritage Collection, from prehistoric stone circles to grand medieval castles, from Roman forts on Hadrian's Wall to a Cold War bunker in the city of York. The collection covers the country and spans 6 millennia, including artifacts associated with the sites, monastic treasures, a Rembrandt self-portrait, and the Duke of Wellington's original Wellington boots. Taken together, the sites in English Heritage's care form a truly national museum for England, and this unrivaled collection offers the chance to explore the great turning points in English history, including the Normans' victory over the Anglo-Saxons at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, a historical date that every school child in Britain knows, and also Charles Darwin's writing on the origin of species. But the collection also covers the everyday backdrops to past lives, like deserted medieval villages and the factory where the bobbins for the cotton industry were produced in the 19th century. I should add that while English Heritage charges visitors to enter some of our sites, the majority are free to enter, but they are not, and I cannot stress this enough, free to maintain. It is a very costly business. Over the centuries, the care and presentation of this collection has been the responsibility of a number of government state departments. 40 years ago, in 1983, the care of the collection was handed over to a non-departmental public agency, a quango we call it, formerly called the Historic Buildings and Monuments Commission, but with the snappier public-facing name of English Heritage. And that English Heritage, and forgive me, it can get a little bit confusing, was also responsible for advising the government on England's wider heritage beyond the National Heritage Collection, whether privately or publicly owned. In April 2015, the old English Heritage split in two. The half responsible for advising the government was renamed Historic England, and the other half, which cares for the National Heritage Collection, became an independent charity and kept the name English Heritage, so no longer part of government. As a charity, English Heritage's purpose is twofold: conservation and inspiration. We need to look after the National Heritage Collection to ensure that these physical eyewitnesses to our past, built of stone, brick and iron, not only survive, but are handed down to future generations in a better condition than the one inherited by the charity. And we also need to inspire people to value, visit, and enjoy these great sites where history was made. So how is our charity doing? Very well. We're now backed by more than 1 million members, and the pandemic notwithstanding, we are welcoming more visitors than ever before, while we are also engaging thousands of local people at their free-to-enter sites. We're also receiving greater support from a growing number of philanthropists. And it's because of successes like this that the English Heritage Charity is spending more on conservation compared with what it was doing when it was in government. Recent conservation projects include repairing the slate roof at Elsay Hall in the northeast of England, a huge undertaking involving a gigantic scaffold, which, as part of our Conservation in Action programme, people were able to climb up to see the work up close. And once they've seen enough, our younger visitors could enjoy a speedy descent thanks to a specially installed and incredibly good fun slide. We wanted to make a virtue of what could potentially be, for the visitor, inconvenient and disruptive works by allowing them to be part of them, to see what we're doing, and also to have the fun of sliding down afterwards. I do not want to understate the challenges that looking after these sites involves. A few years ago, on the southeast coast, a section of Hurst Castle's wall collapsed, a victim of coastal erosion and frequent storms. The castle is probably the most difficult of our sites to protect, and we are undertaking an extensive study to understand better the natural forces at work on this coastal fort. But the question of the long-term future of many at-risk heritage sites is one to which there are no easy answers. Making good Hurst Castle and all our conservation projects support traditional skills, craftspeople, and apprenticeships. But they also provide opportunities for the public to appreciate the care these buildings require. And that is conservation. So, what about inspiration? I'd like to share two different examples to illustrate how the charity is bringing history to life at all of our sites. And one is a grand country house, the other also a coastal fortress. First, let me introduce you to Audley End House, an hour or so outside of London, and its Victorian cook and YouTube star, Mrs. Avis Crocombe. Avis was born in Devon in southwest England in 1839. Her father was a farmer, and at the age of 13, she became a servant, working her way up from kitchen maid to housekeeper. By 1881, she had become the cook for Lord and Lady Braybrook at their country home, Audley End. From the kitchen, she and her team produced dishes such as roasted swan, Victorian curries, and chocolate pudding for the Braybrooks and their guests. And Avis wrote down all her recipes in a book. And we know this because a few years ago, her cookery book was discovered in a drawer and kindly donated to English Heritage. One of the trends within the heritage sector right now is for immersive experiences, where visitors can get a real sense of the past. So at Audley End, our interpretation team took Avis's recipes and, working with reenactors, they brought those recipes to life for people visiting in the kitchen there. They then went a step further and filmed Avis, played by the reenactor, and put these historical cooking recreations online. The YouTube videos showcasing Victorian recipes for butter, for hearty soups and ice cream have been a smash hit, gaining millions of fans in Britain and around the world. Avis is huge in America. So the next stop is in Cornwall on the southwest coast. Tintagel Castle is a site where history and legend are inextricably intertwined. From about the 5th to the 7th century, Tintagel was an important stronghold and probably a residence of rulers of the region. Our archaeological excavations have uncovered fragments of pottery imported from the Eastern Mediterranean, attesting to its links with Europe. It was probably memories of this seat of kings that inspired the 12th century writer Geoffrey of Monmouth to name it in his History of the Kings of Britain as the place where King Arthur was conceived. In turn, these associations with legend led the hugely rich and ambitious Richard, Earl of Cornwall, to build a castle here in the 1230s. The site was of no military value. Legend alone seems to have inspired him to build it here. Today, the remains of that 13th century castle can be seen both on the mainland and on the jagged island jutting out into the sea. In between the two halves of the castle is an enormous void, but Tintagel's divided land masses were once united by a narrow strip of land. So significant was this historic crossing that it gave rise to the place's name, the Cornish Din Tagel, meaning the fortress of the narrow entrance. Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote that this land bridge was so narrow that 3 armed men would be able to defend it, even if you had the whole kingdom of Britain at your side. Now that land crossing vanished in the 15th or 16th century, but in 2019, English Heritage restored it with a daring and beautiful footbridge and reunited the castle's 2 separated halves for the first time in more than 500 years. Our elegant and slender footbridge consists of two independent cantilevers that reach out from either side and almost touch in the middle. At the centre of the bridge, a narrow gap has been designed to represent the transition between the mainland and the island, the present and the past, history and legend. The bridge complements and does not compete with the outstanding landscape, and whereas previously the ruins of the castle sitting opposite each other across the chasm were difficult to understand, our bridge, at a stroke, makes Tintagel whole again. Crucially, it also protects Tintagel's archaeology and ecology by helping to spread visitors across the site in a more manageable way. As a sector, we are increasingly acknowledging the importance of accessibility, and our footbridge at Tintagel now allows step-free access to the island. This footbridge at Tintagel Castle is emblematic of our ambitions as a charity to bring history to life in imaginative ways. It opened in 2019 to widespread acclaim. But unfortunately, about half a year later, it would close, along with all our other staffed sites, as England went into lockdown. That unprecedented closure of our sites, the collapse of the overseas visitor market, and the limited number of visitors who we were able to welcome because of the restrictions, meant that the charity lost a huge amount of income. Stonehenge, normally a hotbed of international tourists, was strangely silent. English Heritage weathered the pandemic, but that was only because of the support of our members, our visitors, donors, and the government. What the pandemic did do was underline the importance of the National Heritage Collection. During the different lockdowns, we kept approximately 200 of our free-to-enter sites open for locals to use for their daily exercise. And we were told that these were a tremendous resource. While once our staffed sites were able to reopen, we saw a boom in visitor numbers to our smaller, more local sites, with several of them reporting their best year since records began. It was a long and hard pandemic, but one silver lining appears to be that with people staying closer to home, they have discovered their local heritage. I think there is something deeper going on too. Sites like Dover Castle with its Roman lighthouse are the places where history happened. And in these uncertain times, whether it's a pandemic, war in the Ukraine, or economic hardship, these ancient sites bring us solace and refreshment because they have survived, and because they are still standing, they inspire us and give us hope for the future. So given all the above and that hunger for heritage, English Heritage has come out of the pandemic with a renewed sense of purpose. Firstly, we are opening and investing in more of our sites. Last year, Clifford's Tower in the city of York in the north of England reopened following a major conservation and representation project. This much-loved landmark is almost all that's left of the medieval York Castle. And where previously the tower was an empty shell, the charity has now installed a freestanding timber structure inside, protecting the ruin and creating a new roof deck to provide magnificent views over York. On the first floor, aerial walkways allow visitors to discover spaces not seen since the 17th century. The timber structure that we have installed within the tower is, like our Tintagel footbridge, another example of the charity's commitment to using sensitive contemporary design to open up our historic sites to more people and do their stories justice. Post-pandemic, we have also relaunched our education programme and are encouraging more schools to get out of the classroom and visit the places where history really happened. English Heritage is one of the largest providers of school trips, and with studies consistently showing that children's mental health, and in particular that of children from low-income homes or with special educational needs, has worsened during the pandemic, we believe that school trips are more important than ever before. I mentioned earlier the trend to provide immersive experiences at historic sites. School groups visiting Stonehenge get a real insight into Neolithic life at the monument, leaving the formal structures of the classroom behind them and learning how to make rope from the river reeds, construct hazel rod fences, and even bake bread. With the care for the National Heritage Collection passing from the state to a charity, the collection relies more than ever on the public, whether it's as a visitor or as a volunteer at one of our sites. And since becoming a charity, our volunteer numbers have swelled. A donor or one of our members. For English Heritage, the future of heritage rests on engaging with as many people as possible from all different backgrounds and involving them in our work, giving them a feeling of ownership and showing them how the past still resonates today. In some places, the link from the past to the present is obvious and direct. For instance, 80 years ago, at Audley End, the home to the cook whom I mentioned earlier, Polish Special Forces trainees engraved their names on a wall before being dropped behind enemy lines to fight for their homeland during the Second World War. Their story of heroism and sacrifice resonates with the current terrible events in Ukraine, as there are deep connections between Ukrainians and Poles. As I said, the future of heritage rests on engaging with as many people as possible, but in particular the young. I am tremendously proud of our National Youth Engagement Programme, Shout Out Loud, which provides a platform for young people to discover our sites and collections, helping them to uncover untold stories from our past and share their perspectives on heritage. Many of our historic sites are national or even international landmarks. All of them are local landmarks and sit within local communities. Every day, hundreds of local volunteers up and down the country help us to look after our sites and share those site stories with our visitors. More than 4,000 people volunteer their time with us, a figure that's more than doubled since we became a charity. They learn new skills, create new connections between sites and local communities, and make vital contributions to almost every aspect of our work. We're enabling more local people to get involved with their local sites through hosting community events, raising funds, or helping with construction. We're particularly focusing on our free-to-enter sites, but we've had success at our paid-for sites too. At Beeston Castle in Cheshire, local volunteers came together to use archaeological evidence and prehistoric tools to reconstruct an authentic Bronze Age roundhouse that provides an educational experience with a difference for pupils from nearby schools. You can see them building it here on the right. And finally, English Heritage is committed to exploring the history of our sites more deeply and more broadly than ever before. The extraordinary range of the sites, statues, plaques, monuments, and collections in our care provide, to an unparalleled degree, rich material for exploring England's past. That means telling familiar stories, but it also means addressing those communities and groups in our country whose histories may have been previously overlooked. For example, at Porchester Castle in Hampshire on the south coast of England, we recently uncovered the fascinating story of Caribbean prisoners of war held there in the 1790s, and that's a story we now tell in full at the site. While at Clifford's Tower in York, which I spoke about earlier, we now share much better with our visitors one of the worst anti-Semitic massacres of the Middle Ages, when the city's Jewish community were trapped in the tower by a violent mob, and many Jews chose to commit suicide rather than be murdered. I have never been as proud of English heritage as when 800 years after that massacre, we invited members of the local Jewish community to celebrate Hanukkah last month at Clifford's Tower. Our aim then is to add to the history of our sites, not to take away, and if possible, to make history too. So I hope you found what I had to say interesting, and I hope, despite the little delay at the beginning, that we will have time to hear some of your thoughts and questions. Thank you.